Welcome to Bigfoot Society. If you have Bigfoot activity to report from the same areas discussed in this episode, please reach out to me directly after this episode. And if you'd like to be on the podcast to discuss a personal Bigfoot encounter, please reach out to me directly at bigfootsociety@gmail.com. Do you wish there was more Bigfoot Society to listen to every week? Well, there is now. If you become a supporting member over at Patreon, you get a special members-only episode every single week on Wednesdays, and sometimes even more episodes. Head on over to patreon.com/the Bigfoot Society. And now let's get on with the show. The following remote interview happens in the region around Oakridge, Oregon, at a cabin out in the woods. That being said, the audio might be a bit different than what you're used to, but enjoy, as this is the first time this individual has shared this information. There may be hot mics, mic issues, and other things that you notice in the background, but don't let that stop your enjoyment of this. And again, thank you to Kevin for coming on the podcast. Enjoy. And we're okay with Kevin, first name only?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start with Kevin introduced me to his property, which is pretty far up in the woods. And Kevin, thank you for inviting me out to your picnic table at your property. It is very nice out here. Your dog is running around. We've been tossing the ball he's pretty good at running around getting that. But do you mind, is there anything you can share about the area that we're in, just for the listeners to get a visual of what we're looking at?
Yeah, sure. Where we live here in Oregon, it's nestled in the west side of the Cascade slopes, and it has a lot of Native American history and a lot of settler history related to the Oregon Trail and different routes that were trying to be discovered for easier access, because everyone was heading to the Willamette Valley, which is where Eugene sits, and all the bigger cities in Oregon. So basically in Western Oregon, once you get out of the valley areas, you end up with all small rural towns that might be 10, 15, 20 miles apart, and probably averaging anywhere from 1,000 people maybe to 3,000 or 5,000 people. So a lot of small spread out towns dispersed in a really large forest system. And so where we're at here, this is the Willamette National Forest, one of the largest national forests in the United States. There's just a huge amount of roads and different ecosystems. You go from 1,000 feet in elevation all the way up to 10,358 feet at the top of South Sister Mountains, which is the pinnacle of Willamette National Forest. And that's bordered on the eastern side by Deschutes National Forest over there in eastern Oregon in Bend area. But anyways, really lush area, really pretty area. And I spent decades out here, me and my wife, backpacking and exploring and really just finding places away from people. And before I had children, my oldest daughter's 9, we always went camping. That's what we did. I worked 50, 60-hour weeks at shops in Eugene. And at the end of the work week, we'd have our packs packed, and I'd cram them in the back of my 94 Jeep Cherokee, and we would oftentimes leave Friday night and drive for an hour and a half, 2 hours to get up into the national forest, and then hike into campsites just to spend as much time as we could out in the woods. We both really enjoyed it, and it decompressed us. And for me, growing up rurally in rural communities, on farms, on ranches, I spent most of my adolescence growing up in eastern Oregon, outside of Pendleton, on the Umatilla Indian Reservation out there. And I worked for all the ranchers that had big ranches and big farms nestled up against the slopes of the Blue Mountains out there. And just a beautiful area. And for me, I came from Florida. I moved up here when I was 11 from Southwest Florida, just south of Fort Myers. And even down there, my family, we lived pretty much out in the middle of nowhere. We were the typical southern swamp kids. I don't know, most of the time I probably was barefoot and shirtless. Mm-hmm. And when I was my boys' age now, which they're 7, me and my younger brother, we'd take the John boat out and we'd go hunt alligators and bring back little 3-foot, 4-foot alligators and just spend our days exploring. And the funny thing is, now that I've gotten more familiar with this Bigfoot phenomenon and had experiences myself, think about how remote I lived in Florida, and my mom and dad got divorced at an early age, so there's 2 different houses that we spent our time at. And my dad lived out in the middle of big swamps. There was no houses around us for 6 or 7 miles. And I never experienced anything in Florida, and I know people say that there's a lot of activity down there. I believe them. I think that there's a lot of people that have these experiences, and they just don't automatically go to Bigfoot as a first explanation, which in my case, for the experiences that I had, while most of these happened, and I didn't realize what was really behind it until years later, even decades later on some of these. And when you start thinking it and putting it together and being like, aha, that explains what happened. And it was when that Finding Bigfoot show kicked off. And there's a lot of fans of that show, and we discussed my opinions on it. And I think it really mainstreamed the Bigfoot thing.
Absolutely.
Really brought it out there. But it was more entertainment. And the hooting and hollering and these microscopic noises that you hear in your TV, when these shows debuted, and they're like, you hear, that's a Sasquatch. It's a hard bill to sell, to people that have never had experiences. But what I really did get out of that show was listening to people share their encounters. Mm-hmm. And after listening to several of the very first episodes of Finding Bigfoot, me and my wife both looked at each other and were like, we started recounting all these experiences we had, and we were like, that explains exactly what we had happen. Yeah, with that, I'll just jump into some of the experiences that I've had. And I'll give as much detail as I can to paint the picture. And unless for people that have never been to the Pacific Northwest, you spent the last few days running around here, really just dipping your toes into the vastness that's out here. This is a rugged place, and nature rules out here for the most part. I mean, you look at right now, we're surrounded by wildfires, and that's normal. I have my camper packed right now. I have all my important stuff in there, ready to go in case we have to leave. I've had to evacuate the last 5 years. And so it's just one of those things you prepare for. Reminds me of being in Florida, preparing for hurricanes. So I mean, nature still rules out here. And a lot of these places are, even though there's roads going everywhere in this Willamette National Forest, there's just so much uncharted land. There's 2,000 plus miles worth of road in this national forest. You could spend decades trying to drive these roads, and I'm friends with a lot of third generation loggers up here, and even these guys haven't explored all the roads out here. It's just incredible how much room there is. I ran a backpacking business where I take people out on paid hikes and everything, and after getting really involved with backpacking myself and spending months outside literally every year, sleeping under the stars, finding the most remote corners of this Western Oregon Cascade slope wilderness areas, and just spending weeks out in these quiet spots, we really got to know the area well. And my experiences with Bigfoot really only started happening when I moved to Western Oregon. And once I made the realization of what was going on, like I said, sometimes 10 years later plus on some of these experiences, it was kind of exciting and made me a little bit apprehensive, especially now that I have children. And so all my kids, I have 2 7-year-old boys that are twins, and I have a 9-year-old daughter, and we camp all the time. We go super remote. My camp trailer's set up for boondock camping. We never go to campgrounds. We go 30, 40 miles out, and we'll stay there for as long as we can usually when we go camping. So usually it's 3 days, 5 days, or whatever. So my kids know my stories, and I told my kids all my experiences more as a cautionary tale. I don't know if I don't think these things necessarily want to be your friends. I think they're out there. I don't think that they are prone to violence and disappearing you or murdering you. But with anything, especially large animals, especially intelligent large animals, you gotta consider that's a possibility. And I think it's naive to go into the situation and think that all these things are your friends and they're just gonna do these things where they're knocking on wood and throwing rocks and charging your tent and stuff. Look at Timothy Treadwell and the bears. We talked about that. Mm-hmm. He spent decades with these bears, and then moved out there, and I don't know how many years he spent up there in Alaska with those bears, and finally came across the wrong bear and ate him and his girlfriend right there on camera. Pretty horrific. And I think that could be the case with these animals too. And I think the more intelligent a creature is, the more likely you are to have personalities, and the more likely you are to just come across an angry Sasquatch. So anyways, my kids know about it. it's really just let them know that they're out there. We deal with cougar and bear all the time up here, and wolves and everything. That's not an issue. I just don't want them. If my kid ever went missing, the last thing I want to worry about is my mind would go to, well, crap, like maybe a Bigfoot got him, So anyways, with that, I'll start some of my stories here. So I'm thinking back to my encounters, and I listed them out here, and I got approximate date. And I think for the most part, I got them listed in the chronological order they happened. I don't know if I'm going to really mention the actual years that these happened. I'll give you the baseline, unless you want me to throw it out there.
If that's nothing if you don't mind, that might help.
Sure. Yeah. Like I said, all these experiences that I've had, except for the later ones, 2014 on, we had these encounters, and Bigfoot wasn't on my radar. I mean, I've always heard the stories growing up here, but I've hunted. I hunted a bunch, deer, elk, and lots of bird hunting. And so I've heard stories about Bigfoots, but through most of these encounters, it wasn't like I'm being accosted by a Bigfoot. It was just kind of an unnerving situation, and being around wild animals, I don't spook easy. I've been around plenty of cougars and bears. I've been followed for a day with mountain lions hiking up in the Three Sisters Wilderness, and it's really just not an issue. You learn how to act around them, and they're there. So you never want to freak out. You never want to freak out and run. And so with that being said, so I moved to Eugene area from Pendleton when I was 19, and my wife went to University of Oregon, and she was studying there. I was a farm boy out in Pendleton, Eastern Oregon, on the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and after living in small towns my entire life in rural communities, my wife invited me to be a roommate with her and her other classmates over in Eugene. We were friends. I went to school with my wife. Her dad was my math teacher in high school, actually, and so I moved in with her at Ducks Village in Eugene. And when I got to Eugene, about 200,000-ish population in that area there, because Eugene and Springfield are right next to each other. Second largest metropolitan area in Oregon, small for some of the East Coast stuff. But when I got here, it was exciting. Moving into a bigger city. I've never been in a big city. What Eugene might be considered a small city for most people, but for me, it felt like a big city, and it was exciting. So we spent our first 10 years, eight or 9 years in Eugene, every day just exploring everything we could. We started with the city, and I explored all the parks, and it was fun walking through the downtown areas with big buildings, and everything was so busy and the hustle and bustle of it. And we started exploring outside of the city limits more, and got into Lane County, and then we ended up in the mountains, and that's when I really got into backpacking over here. So in 2008, we were well on our way to pretty much backpacking every chance we got. Me and my wife, we went backpack. Wintertime, it didn't matter. We went in rainstorms, snowstorms. So in 2008, I got invited to go to Thanksgiving up in Astoria, Oregon. My mom actually lives up in Warrenton out there, which sits more west of Astoria. I mean, a couple miles away from the beach, really pretty area. Probably most people recognize it because of the Megler Bridge, that big green bridge that spans the Columbia River there. That area's got a lot of history, a lot of old history. And so we drove to Astoria. I was in my wife's 96 Honda Accord, and we got to the house where my mom lived, and my brother and my sister were there, and they had kids. They had taken all the spare rooms in the house, and so we brought a tent just in case, which we were actually looking forward to camping anyways. We figured we would end up pitching our tent somewhere. My mom offered for us to pitch our tent in her yard, but like I said, we like to seek out those quieter places. And so me and my wife, we decided to go find a little spot off of one of the main highways out there, a mile or two off, and just pitch a tent for a night or two. And that's where we would stay. So we got up to Astoria, met with the family, and it was later afternoon, hung out with them for a few hours. And in November, the sun sets quite a bit earlier up here. You're starting to get into shorter days, winter's coming, and everything like that. And this is before cell phones and the convenience of having a phone you could just shake and get a flashlight on and stuff like that. So one thing I realized I forgot was my flashlights. And so we swung by the Fred Meyer's in Warrenton, and on our way to go find a campsite. And I picked up a Coleman lantern, propane lantern, and I'd never set one up. I was in Boy Scouts growing up and stuff, but they were always had the mantles on them, and so I never had to tie them myself. And so we grabbed a lantern, grabbed one of those 1 pound propane canisters, and threw it in the trunk with our camping gear, and we headed off to go find a spot to camp for a couple days. We drove through Astoria, so we're heading east now on Highway 30, heading towards Sevenson and Rainier and all those little places that are right along the Columbia River there. And we drove 12 to 14 miles east out of Astoria. And once you get out of Astoria, it turns into just logging country. A house here and there sprinkled amongst the forest and everything, but pretty open with a lot of little side roads that come off of it. So 14-ish miles or so out of Astoria, we find a little road to the right. And I have tried to remember the name of that road, but I can't remember the exact name of it. And I've looked on the maps and I found the general area. I couldn't pinpoint the road, but we found this little road and it's getting dusk. You know, the sun's got maybe an hour worth of light left in it. And we find this little road, come off of it, off of Highway 30, go a couple miles up this road and find this little 4x4 track. Some of the locals must wheel their trucks on and stuff like that. Drops sharply off this little gravel road that we had turned onto. So I pulled the car around, figuring there's going to be a wide spot, a camp spot somewhere in there. So I pulled the car off the side of the road, grabbed our tents, and I didn't bring our backpack. So we were just carrying stuff under our arms, you know? And so my wife had the tent. I had some gallon jugs of water, the lantern still in the box and everything. And we hiked down this little trail. And it comes to a T-junction. You come down and then there's a junction. And we went straight and it ended up in these big maple trees. And there was a campsite under there. In fact, actually, there was a whole campsite set up in there. There was multiple tents, picnic tables, camp chairs. And on the picnic table, it had stuff set up, what you see here. It had people's plates and there was some food, chips and stuff in bags. We got in there and everything was covered in leaves because it's fall time, so the trees are dropping their leaves, and it didn't look like anyone had been in that camp for weeks. I mean, there was a good covering of leaves over everything, and it was kind of bizarre, you know. And we looked at the situation, we thought it was odd, and we're like, who knows what the deal is, and so we just went back to that junction on that little 4x4 road, and then we took that other leg that came off of it there. At that point in time, I've been carrying these water bottles, these gallon jugs. So I set them down in the middle of that little T-shaped junction. I'm like, well, let's just walk down here. Let's see if we can't find a spot to put our little 2-person tent. And we walk 200 feet down that road. And this road is surrounded by brush that's 6 or 7 feet tall, Scotch broom, Himalayan blackberries, a lot of scrub, pretty typical to areas that have been logged over a bunch of times. It just turns into a brushy mess. You couldn't walk through this stuff if you wanted to. You know, while walking down this trail, there was just a big enough spot, probably not much bigger than the footprint that this picnic table takes up. Clear it off the side of the road there where some of the bushes have got knocked down, and we set the tent up there. And it's getting fairly dark now, and I'm like, I'm going to get that lantern set up. So I unbox it out there and get the thing put together. I put the mantles on, and I didn't burn the mantles, and I didn't know you had to light the mantles and burn them in. So I just assembled it, put the propane canister on there, and lit it. The propane lantern lit up for about 5 seconds, and it started burning the mantles down from the top, so it turned to ash, and now you have this heavy weight of the unburned mantle. And I just watched as both of those socks just disappeared, and what little light we had disappeared at that point in time. And so at this point in time, it's dusk to the point where you can still see, but it's getting dark. Like you couldn't read a book. It was getting that dark. And so I told my wife, I'm like, we're just gonna have to camp without the lights tonight. It's not a big deal. And I'm like, I told my wife, I'm like, well, I'm gonna head back to that junction and pick up our water jugs that I left there. And she said, okay. She started setting up our sleeping bags and stuff in the tent. So I headed back, and I had my little dog with me, Nori, and she backpacked with us. Such a good dog in the wilderness, super quiet, super calm dog. So we head back to get the water jugs, and we're walking, and Nori's following right behind me like she always does. She never runs in front of us. We broke her of that for hiking on trails. And I'm getting closer to these water jugs at this junction, and I can see them up ahead, 60, 70 feet up ahead. And as I get closer, my dog, she kind of puffs up her scruff on the back of her neck. I look down at her, and she's been in the wilderness tons around bears and cougars, and she's not a very reactive dog. And she kind of growls, and I thought it was odd, and maybe that kind of put me on alert. And so I said, oh, she smells something. And so as I get closer to these water bottles, these gallon jugs, the bushes, the brush on the other side, right immediately 10 feet behind where these jugs are sitting, that whole shrub line just starts shaking. I mean, shaking so hard that leaves are falling off of them. And Nori goes to run up there, and she's growling, and I call her back right away. She made it 5 feet in front of me. I called her back, and so I'm sitting there looking at these jugs, and the bush is still shaking a little bit, and it stops. And I just decided, I got this feeling, I'm like, I don't think we need water tonight. So I just turned around, I left the jugs, and made it back to the tent. My wife asked me why didn't I grab the jugs, and I'm like, I didn't want to tell her what happened, because I mean, it just was kind of an off-putting feeling. I'm like, we'll just get them in the morning. You know, I mean, we had a little water bottle with us, so we still had some water. You know, we'll just grab them in the morning. I didn't want to haul them all the way down here. We get in the tent now, and it's completely dark, and we're setting up to go to sleep. We lay down, and within 5 minutes of laying down, we start hearing things moving through this thick brush. I mean, it started, you could hear it 200 feet away, and sticks snapping and rustling, light rustling here and there. And you know, I'm like, well, you know, there's a lot of coyotes here, and there's bear and I guess cougars too. You know, we usually don't hear the cats. And so we hear this, and my wife's like, yeah, do you hear that? I'm like, yeah, it's probably some animals moving around through here. And well, as we were talking about it, the noises got louder. And it got to the point to where it sounded like there were 3 or 4 truck-sized things running through this brush. And they had run directly to our tent from multiple directions. And they would stop 20 feet away. And then you just hear the brush go crazy. You know, I mean, as they ran back away. And this went on for 30 to 45 minutes. And they got so close. I mean, they were right outside our tent. And me and my wife were laying there and just looking at each other. And she's like, what do you think it is? I'm like, well, probably coyotes or something like that. And it got pretty intense. It got pretty loud. It's to that point to where if you ever been in a tent and you hear something out in the middle of the woods, you get that, I'm just going to lay here and not move deal. And so we just pretty much laid there and listened to it. I was pretty nervous about it. It was definitely aggressive. If animals are doing that to you in the woods, it definitely brings your attention to it. And this went on. And I mean, it was pretty nerve-wracking. When these things would run through the bushes to us, there was no going around brush. They just ran right through it like a truck. And after 45 minutes, the noises died down, and a couple hours later, we ended up falling asleep. And I woke up in the morning, beautiful morning, and got out of the tent and went for a little walk. And there's this big power line path that leads all the way up the east side of the river, and that connects up to Rainier. And I know you've done some stories about Rainier up there. And it was just a really odd experience. And this is the stuff that me and my wife experienced over the decades backpacking and hiking. And like I said, it wasn't until the Finding Bigfoot show came on that we really started putting together what happened. And it was a mix. It was actually exciting, like actually getting an answer for what it was, because it explained everything perfectly. Right. Listen to people's encounter stories on the East Coast. They were describing the same stuff that we had happen, and the exact same stuff. And I mean, there's just no coincidence of what it could be. And so we put it together, what it was, and we started thinking about all these experiences we've had in years past. And so I made a little list of some of the stuff I had happen, you know, and so like I said, we backpacked every chance we could get. And we did that pretty much till we moved out here 11 years ago. And when we moved in here, had a kid, our first year in here, and now I run a business. And I don't have as much time to do the backpacking that I used to do. In 2009, I was still living in Eugene, and it was a weekend, so we took our dogs, I had 2 at that time, Huey and Nori, and we decided to head to the Coast Range to just find a spot out of the way, find a little swimming hole in one of the creeks up there. And the area is Wolf Mountain, which is west of Veneta. And the Coast Range is super rugged. They don't have the big mountains that the Cascades have, but you're either going up or down. You're either in the bottom of the valley or you're on top of it. And that's how the roads go too. We end up finding this section of land. It was actually Weyerhaeuser land, and they have a gate on it, and they say private property, no trespassing. It's more for hunters and stuff. And so we, being younger and more rebellious, we bypassed the gate. I just went around it, and we had a lunch packed, and we were going to find a little creek. It's in the Clay Creek area, and find a little swimming hole and let the dogs play and just spend the afternoon out there. And so we hike in a couple miles and end up at the bottom of this valley where there's a nice creek, little swimming hole, and a recent clear cut that had been done maybe a year prior, you know, so all the big trees were cut down. It was probably a 100-acre clear cut, and the clear cut went straight up this really steep ridge. And I wanted to get to the top of this ridge to see the view. Well, this clear cut is flanked by very large trees. And so when you take out a section of these big trees, it opens the forest up. It's dark in the forest. It was a bright sunny day, but you look into the forest, you couldn't see more than 20, 30 feet into it. It just got so dark in there, and that contrast between the bright light and the dark forest, it makes it impossible to see in. While we're stump jumping, climbing up this really steep hill to get up to the top, and I make it about 3/4 of the way up. My wife's a couple hundred feet behind me. She's always a slower hiker. And I start getting this feeling. It was the same feeling I got when I was camped outside of Astoria there, when I abandoned the water jugs. I just got this feeling a little uneasy that I was being watched. I hadn't heard anything yet. And I put it aside and just continued hiking up the trail. Well, I made it another 50 feet up this steep slope, and you got to weave through this mess of slash and stumps. It's hard hiking. And as I was making my way up the hill, I almost sounded like a gunshot. A dry chunk of tree, not even a branch, getting snapped. Crack. And it's in that big forest that's flanking us on either side. And it's probably 100 yards to each edge of this, maybe 150 yards. And I'm like, oh, I've heard, it sounded like a bear moving through the woods. They're pretty clumsy. They'll step on branches and stuff. I'm like, oh, there's a bear up there. They don't worry me. I've hunted them and been around them, and I'm not too worried about the bears. And I'm like, that's what it was. That's the feeling that I got. So I rode off this out. I continued up, and sticks started snapping and breaking. Big tree knocks, whack on the side of trees, and it was all to the right of me. And like I said, you look into this forest, and it's so dark, but I could see there was almost like shadows moving back there. I could see that there was something in there, and it made me really uneasy. And at this point, I'm only 50 yards from the top of this ridge that I want to get up onto to get my vantage point. I stopped there, and I got even more uneasy. And it was just one of those situations. I always follow my gut when I'm in the woods. I always have. And I just felt really uneasy. And it was a turnaround now kind of a thing. And I didn't want to stand where I was standing. And so I turned around and met back up with my wife. She was a little bit lower down the hill. And I'm like, oh, it just gets so rough and brushy up there. It probably wouldn't be much of a view. I'm like, let's just head back down. And my wife had heard the commotion in the woods too. And I'm like, oh, I think there's a bear up there anyways. I'm like, let's just head down to the creek and enjoy ourselves there. So we went back down to the creek and spent the rest of the day probably 300 yards away from where I was at the top of that ridge, just enjoying ourselves. Nothing else happened that day, but it was the first time that I really started more paying attention to that really off-putting turn around now, your hair's up on the back of your neck kind of deal. And I'd never experienced that hunting or anything, being around mountain lions and bears and stuff like that. I mean, you're always on edge when you see them, but it's not terrifying. That's borderline terrifying. So I spent the rest of our day there, no big deal, but nothing else happened. And so the next experience I had was actually later that year. So I was in my early 20s, and Eugene has that hippie influence, and I was into that scene. And so I did small grows years prior to that, little closet grows and stuff like that. And like most people did in Oregon, pot was still highly illegal, felony for any of it. And my roommate that I was living with at the time, we decided in that year to do a grow out in the forest. And I'm like, we want to pick a spot that's as remote as possible, but has access to where we can get to it and still be able to hike in and not spend 5 hours hiking into this place, because you have to carry the plants up there. We grew them from clones before we planted them, so the plants were already 2 feet tall before we put them in the ground. And grew in this grow site, I think we had 60 or 70 little plants, and it wasn't an industrial operation. It was just us kids messing around, having fun at it, thinking we were going to make millions off this stuff, which was never the case. So we find this spot, and Google Maps really was a new thing then. And so it was pretty unbelievable to be able to pull up on your computers. I think my computer is still running Windows 98 or 95 or something like that at that time. Pull up these maps and be able to get these satellite overlays of these areas. And that's what I used to pick the spot where we ended up growing this year. And I earmarked a couple sites that were super remote. They were nestling up into the west slopes of the Cascades. They weren't super high elevation because you don't want to get too much elevation because you need to get warmer weather in the fall. If you get too high, you're going to get froze out before your plants finish. And so we go up there that early spring to scout spots to put our plants. And so I go up with my wife and my roommate, Terry, and we go to check out this first spot. And it's about 3/4 of a mile of a brush whack off of these logging roads that you drive for 12 or 14 miles. And they're so brushy, brush is dragging down the side of your vehicle while you're doing it, and so we get to the spot where I marked it. And this is before GPS and everything. So we always just navigated with map and compass. And the GPS units they had then were expensive and fairly clunky. Gray screen, none of that nice overlay, like not having your tablet out in the woods like it is now, and so we hike into this first spot that I had marked, and 3/4 mile hike in, kind of picking our way through this forest area that had been logged several times over. Every time they log, they plant 3 trees for every tree they cut. So that process, if you repeat it over several times, you can imagine how dense the trees get after they keep on replanting 3-to-1 on their cuttings. This stuff's super dense, and I'm heading for this open spot that I saw on the satellite. It was probably a half acre in between all this old, or this new reprod, which is what they call the trees that they plant after they log. And we get up into this spot finally. It takes, 45 minutes of bust and brush to get up there. And it's actually a perfect spot to grow. I had a little spring that popped up in the middle, really brushy, some blackberry up in the middle of it, but had enough room to where we would get sunlight, enough sunlight to do what we wanted to do. As we got into this clearing, I got that feeling again. Same feeling I got when I was over in Wolf Mountain, and the same feeling I got outside of Astoria. That really uneasy, like you're being watched, and really just very uncomfortable. Like you wouldn't want to spend any amount of time up there with that feeling. And so we scout around it, and we brought a lunch. We were planning on eating a lunch out there, and I was talking to Terry about the spot, and Terry's like, yeah, I like the spot. I didn't say anything to my wife or my buddy that was with me about how I was feeling about the spot. We decided not to eat our lunch there. We spent maybe 6 or 7 minutes in this place before we decided to hike back to the rig. Well, we made it back to the rig, and I asked my buddy, I'm like, what do you think about this spot? And he says, well, he's like, the spot's great. He said, but I had a horrible feeling going in there. He said it was super uncomfortable. My wife said the same thing. And I told them how I felt about it. I'm like, well, I had the same thing happen. I was just very uncomfortable. That walk back out was worse than anything, just because it was so thick. You couldn't move fast through this stuff. We didn't hear anything or see anything on that trip, but we decided not to grow at that spot. So we got back in the rig, drove up the road another 4 or 5 miles, so to where these logging roads really start petering out. And I had another spot marked, and we parked the car. This spot's about a quarter mile off the road. And so we bushwhack our way to it. And this spot is up on ridges and the hillsides in between the ridge and the valleys. And they're probably 50-degree slopes, really steep. So when you're climbing up this, you're grabbing trees and branches, and we're heading to this other open spot that we thought might be a good place, right next to a little creek. We get up there and find that there's these little terraces where the hillside slumped over the years. These little terrace spots that are pretty flat. And that's the open spots that I was seeing on the map. And there's about 5 or 6 of them that continue down the hill. The creek kind of followed them. It was a perfect spot. And I told my buddy, I'm like, this is a spot. And no off-putting feelings or anything like that. On that earlier hike we did that day, no one talked about it. And all the uneasiness seemed to disappear. I'm like, oh, this is going to be the spot. So the next week, I organized a couple of my buddies to help us get our supplies up there. And we got all the stuff up there, all of our plants and all of our supplies we're going to need throughout the year. And our schedule was, in the summertime, every other week on Friday, we would leave Eugene at about 11 o'clock. And we drive up to this area, which is in the Linn County line up there. So it took us about an hour to an hour and 20 minutes to drive up to the spot. And then it was we always park about 1.5 miles away from where the spot was, even though it was only a quarter mile off the road. We don't want to park right below it. And so we would park and then do about 1.5 miles walk in. And so it's after midnight. And the stipulation I had for doing this was, 1, we never took any guns with us. Because 1, I didn't want that to be part of it. And 2, like I said, back in the day, you got caught doing the stuff. That's just an extra felony thrown on top of it. And so we would go up and hike into the spot, and we would do our pruning and our watering and fertilizing and stuff like that, and spend a few hours up in the spot in the middle of the night doing it. We'd usually come out about 4 o'clock or so in the morning back to the rig. And so as we're doing this through the summer, we started having some strange experiences up there, and we heard the sound of car doors slamming, just boom. And it only sounded like they were 100 feet away, but there was just no way. There's no cars up there. We walked the roads to this spot, and this spot's at the end of Dead End Road, and there's no roads besides the one we came in on, there's no roads within 3/4 to a mile away from there. And those roads are so brushy anyways, no one's going to be out there in the middle of the night. So we'd hear these car doors slam, and we would hear what almost sounded like gunshots occasionally, but they weren't as sharp. It would just be a loud crack, maybe 500, 600 feet away. And me and Terry discussed it, and our rule was, if we ever found that anyone had gotten in there, we get found out, you just abandon the site and you never come back. And so we just dealt with that through the whole summer. And I mean, the car door thing was the weirdest. It just, that sounded like a newer car, not like an 80s square body Chevy. I mean, like a newer car where the doors close and there's no rattle and you get that loud clunk as it closes. Just tons of that. And my buddy Terry was joking around. He's maybe it's haunted up here, and we always had our chuckle about it, and so later in the year, in late September, going into October, we harvested as far into October as we could get it before the frost kicked us out of there. We started going every week and doing our late night prunings. And it was our last weekend that we were going up there to do our maintenance before we come back and harvest our little crops, which the plants did not do good. They were tall. They were big plants, 10 feet tall, 9 feet tall, but they were so spindly, growing in that clay soil, and we got some stuff off of them, but it wasn't anything to write home about. And so our end of our season there, a week before we decided to harvest, we go up to do our normal deal, get them pruned up and cleaned up, ready to go to take back and haul our bounty back home. And after a long summer of growing these things, we were pretty excited about it. And so we get up there and we do our pruning and all of our stuff that we're doing. I'm up in the upper plot. Terry's in one of the lower plots down there, and it's probably 150 feet separated. I mean, down this incredibly steep slope. Once you come off those terrace sections, you're going down, you're side footing it on the hills and to get to the next one. While I'm stashing the stuff up at the very top plot. Oh, and I forgot to mention, we had a couple weeks prior to that, I come up there on the top plot, and there's probably 20 plants or so on that top plot. And 3 or 4 of them had been ripped out of the ground and thrown up into the trees.
Really?
15, 20 feet up in the tree, there's this whole plant sitting there. And we saw some elk sign. And growing up on ranches, I watched horses grab plants and shake them and throw them. I was just like, we might have some elk in here picking on this stuff. And we found it odd. We actually discussed abandoning it because of that. We're like, man, maybe someone's in here. Maybe a hunter had found it, and maybe we should just call it quits and not come back. And so anyways, our last week there, I'm up there at top plot, stashing my stuff underneath this Douglas fir tree, the watering containers and stuff like that, so it couldn't be spotted, because they used helicopters back then. They were flying helicopters all over the place. And as I'm stashing the stuff, the creek's to my back here, and there's a slight open area probably about to the edge of where it drops off right there. And I see out of my peripheral this really dark black shadow just zoom by. I mean, no brush noise or anything like that, just caught my attention. I looked over there, and I should also note that our flashlights that we didn't use really bright flashlights, for obvious reasons.
Right.
So I had LED headlamps just started coming out. I don't know if you ever bought the first generation LED headlamps.
No.
They were bluish, purplish colored, and you couldn't see 10 feet on a nice night with those things. There was enough light to work in, and plus that wavelength too. I mean, it just really messed with your depth perception. You can't see. It drowns out some of the colors and textures of things. So anyways, I see the shadow move, and it gets my attention. And so I sat there for a couple minutes listening, and I didn't hear anything. And so I was like, maybe it's an elk moving through there really quick or something, which I mean, it would have made a lot of noise if it was an elk. But that's the explanation I came up with that time. So packed the stuff up and put my backpack on, clicked on my crappy REI headlamp, and started heading down to Terry. And about the time I started coming off that first plot to come down towards where Terry was, I started hearing brush breaking. It started about 150 feet above me on the hillside, right where that shadow, that dark figure had ran to. And I would start walking, and it would start walking. And I mean, at first it was pacing. I was going the same speed I was going, but I mean, in the thick brush, moving. So you hear it. I mean, just like walking through thick brush, snapping, crackling. It wasn't rushing at that point. And I would stop, and it would stop. As I got closer to Terry, down there on the lower plot, it started picking up. Every time it started moving, it started getting faster and faster. And so this thing started pretty much running to me. And when I would stop, a couple seconds later, it would stop. But every time it would get closer, and I got that feeling again. I'm like, oh man, here we are, middle of the night, a couple 3.5 inch pocket knives, and I make it down to Terry. I'm like, hey, I just want to let you know, when I was up there at top plot, I don't know if there's a bear or an elk. I saw something move up there, and it was moving down the hill with me when I was going, and Terry hadn't heard it at that point. And he's like, well, okay. And I'm like, let's grab our stuff and let's take the shortcut. Let's just go straight down the steepest parts, and let's just get onto the road and get back to the car. So as soon as we started walking through that bottom plot, this thing started running again. And Terry looks at me and he says, "What the hell is that?" I'm like, "That's what I was talking about." I'm like, "It'll be fine." I'm like, "Do not freak out and run." I'm like, "If it's a bear or a cougar," I'm like, "it will chase you if you run." I'm like, it'll be fine. I've dealt with animals in the woods before and I've never had an issue. I'm like, you just need to be cool about it. And so we start moving down again and this thing starts running. And every time, it sounds like a truck driving down this hill, just snapping, breaking trees, like trees that were in there were 20-year-old, 15-year-old reprods. So they're all about this big around, about 6 to 8 inches, at the base. And Douglas fir, they grow in pretty thick, and these things are thick in there, So you can't see more, usually, especially once you get off these plots, you can't see more than 5 or 6 feet in front of you before you have a tree and branches, and you can see the gaps in between there. We start making it off this edge, and this thing starts coming. And now it's within 75 feet-ish of us. And we start and stop multiple times. And I told Terry, I'm like, "Take your knife out." And he takes out his little pocket knife. I'm in front. And I pull my pocket knife out. And I told Terry, I'm like, "If this animal comes down and starts attacking, I'm like, you stab it until it stops attacking. And I'll make sure I do the same for you." And Terry looked quite nervous. I'm like, "But do not run." And Terry's okay. And so we stop and listen. We don't hear anything. We start walking. And again, this thing starts coming. And now it's coming. It's just coming with a vengeance. And we stop. And this time, it doesn't stop. And it's just coming. We're sitting there looking up the hill. Time seems to slow down in those moments. It's just coming towards you. And you're thinking about all these movies you watch and everything about these animals coming and grabbing you. You have nowhere to go, nowhere to run. You can't move over this terrain. The only thing to do is stand there and just prepare. And so I'm down in the ready. And this thing's coming. And it's coming. And my heart rate's sitting there pumping. And it's a chilly night, so as I'm exhaling, my breath it's a nice still night too. My breath is just coming up and wrapping over my headlamp, so I'm exhaling to the side so I can see and get the condensation from my breath out of my field of view. And this thing is just running straight at us, and I'm sure we're about to get attacked by whatever it is, And so I'm down ready. It's brush snapping, breaking, closer, stops about 10 feet in front of me, directly in front of me. And so I'm sitting there looking straight ahead, kind of slightly hunched down, kind of in that batter's position, ready to go. And this thing stops and the noise stops. And looking through the trees with this crappy headlamp, in between the Douglas fir branches, there's gaps. And I can see this blackish fur, and it's got a little bit of a shine to it when I'm looking. And as I move my headlamp up, I see these splotches of fur, and I get to about 8 feet where I'm looking up, about 8 feet tall, just 10 feet in front of me, and I can see black fur still, and I can see these lighter patches. And I think I was looking at its chest. So I sat there with my knife ready. My buddy Terry had his hand on my shoulder behind me, and just waiting for this thing to come the rest of the way and confront us. And we sat there for probably 6 or 7 seconds, just staring at it. And all of a sudden, I hear it shuffle, and it turned. And when it turned, I saw this light flash come through. And I think what I saw was its palm. And it was about the size of a baseball mitt, like an adult's baseball mitt. It's just this flash that went through this crappy light. I was really cussing that headlamp. All I wanted to do was see. You can't run, and you want to be able to see. And this thing turned, and you can hear it on 2 legs taking these huge steps going down this really steep slope. And it disappeared out of earshot within 5 seconds. Just disappeared. And we sat there for another minute. And I told Terry, I'm like, "Let's head back to the truck." And so we hiked out of there, headed back to the truck. And anyways, we ended up going back the next week and finished up our plants and stuff. And, I didn't know what to think of it. And I really never, we chatted about it a little bit on the way back to town, but I just didn't know what to think about it, and really didn't have a firm place to put this experience, and so time goes by, and it just was one of those odd experiences. And then, like I said, once that show came on TV, Finding Bigfoot and stuff, I'm like, yeah, that was a Bigfoot standing in front of me. I saw a Bigfoot. And years later, actually a few years later, Terry now lives in Idaho, and I went to buy that camper over there because I had a really good deal during the pandemic. And so we drove over to Boise, and I hadn't seen Terry in 7 or 8, and no, probably even longer than that, maybe 10 years. And so we meet up with them in town while I'm waiting for the paperwork to get done on the camp trailer. And it was on my mind because I knew I had to put all this stuff together, and I had a pretty good idea about what was going on to us out there. And I talked to Terry about it. I'm like, hey, you remember that grow we did out in Lane County line? He's, oh yeah. I asked Terry, I'm like, you remember that thing that chased us down the hill? He's, oh yeah, I remember that. I'm like, what did you see? Because I never asked Terry what he saw. And he says, I didn't see anything because I was behind you. And I was kind of shocked. I'm like, you didn't see that thing standing right in front of us? And Terry's like, no, I didn't see it. I was actually a little disappointed. I'm like, man, and maybe it's a good thing you didn't see it. Because Terry was pretty spooked. And walking back on that road, I heard it run off. And that uneasiness just left. I was just back in the woods again. But yeah, it was incredible. And I don't know the whole door slamming thing and stuff like that, like how they make the noise, but it's so distinctive. And I've heard that many times before in places where you wouldn't expect to hear it. And I don't know if it's them smacking their chest and making a big exhale, but it's pretty incredible sound. Mimicry. I think these things mimic the sounds that they hear. And I don't know why they do it. It seemed territorial, obviously, because it was running us out there, but why it waited all summer with having those noises around us all summer, I don't know. But made it out of there unscathed with another experience. And so where am I at here? So the next year I kept on backpacking, and that was the last year I grew. It was just too much work, and I got busier with my career. I'm a mechanic. I've been a mechanic for 25 years, and it's just the whole growing thing, especially once it turned legal, like I just didn't want any part of it. It was fun to do as a kid. It wasn't a commercial venture. It was just kids being kids. But anyways, backpacking was my true passion, and that kind of took away from backpacking. So me and my wife, she was my girlfriend then, we found the spot in Three Sisters Wilderness. Mm-hmm. This is on the western slopes of the mountains there in the Willamette National Forest, probably 35 miles, 40 miles as a crow would fly from here. Just a absolutely gorgeous area. In my opinion, being around the state and backpacking the whole state, it's some of the prettiest hiking you can find in Oregon. And Linton Meadows in particular, it's this meadow system that comes off the PCT, runs on the top side of it. And this meadow system drops for miles and miles below it. So you get these terraced lava flows that have huge meadows, 200-acre meadows, and they open up to South Sister, this huge volcanic mountain that's got glaciers on it. And South Sister has a lot of red rock in it. It's just absolutely stunning. We actually end up getting married out there. That's where my wife, we did a wilderness wedding. I got my brother ordained and hiked in. My in-laws, you can only take 12 people in the wilderness. And I was starting to get into guiding at this point in time. So I was running some nonprofits as a guide and taking a bunch of people out. And so I had tons of gear for backpacking, and me and my wife decided we didn't want a church wedding. But anyways, we chose the spot because it's so pretty and it's off the beaten path. A lot of people might day trip it if they're out there backpacking, but it's 13 miles to the nearest trailhead, and it's hard hiking. So Eileen Lake was our main destination. So we go in, it's about 2010, and we always liked later season hikes. So it was September, maybe a couple weeks into September, and we picked that because one, the crowds are less and the bugs leave. The mosquitoes can be horrendous out there all the way through August, and it's such a pretty spot. It sucks if you got to spend your time under mosquito netting. And so we hike in, just me and my wife, and spend all day hiking. It is a hard hike. I mean, my packs were heavier than they should have been. I was probably carrying 70 pounds. My wife was probably carrying 55 or 60. She's a trooper. I mean, she could put miles on and never complains about it. And I introduced her to backpacking. So she cut her teeth with it, with me. And it was just such a great experience. So we hike in to Linton Meadows, and it takes us all day to get into there. By the time we get into Linton Meadows, it's a super dry year, we were running low on water. We had been out of water for the last few miles, and I knew there were springs down there in Linton Meadows, so our plan was to just get into where the meadows start and post up camp, find some water, and then the next morning hike the rest of the 1.5 miles to Eileen Lake, which is our destination. We were going to spend about a week and a half out there. So we drop into the meadow, and the sun's got about 1.5 hours worth left of light on it. But it gets dark quick up there because everything's so up and down, and we're in this valley. You can be a couple hours away from sunset and be in complete shade and darkness. So we come into this meadow, and it's one of the larger meadows that are up there. And you get out of the trees, and all of a sudden the views open up, and there's a mountain. I mean, lit up by the setting sun, alpine glow. It's just, you're going to be spending a week and a half up there, and you have nothing to do, and it's the best feeling. And we're tired. We're thirsty. We find a little spring that's trickling right by the trail as we enter the meadow. So we set our tent up right where this meadow starts to open up, and there's these little tree peninsulas that open up into the meadow. So you get these little kind of jets of trees that come out in between the meadow. So we camped about 50 feet away from the edge of this tree line, right where you come into the meadow, where you first start to get to the meadows. Set our tent up, got water, fed the dogs their dehydrated dog backpacking food, and made our dinner. And we're sitting in our camp chairs, shoes off, just enjoying it. And we're looking across the meadow on the other side, and the meadow runs up this really steep hillside. And as we're eating our dinner, this whole herd of deer, I've never seen so many blacktail deer out there, but this whole herd of probably 12 deer just explode out of the woods, past the trail that we came in on, probably 100 feet away from us. And they are running full bore, and they run straight up this hillside. I mean, you'd have to use all fours to climb up that mountainside. I mean, it was steep. You can just see this thing. They are just running. And I told my wife, I'm like, oh, something's chasing those things. Mountain lions and bears are really common up there. And so I'm like, well, probably cat chasing them. And so we just sat there and watched them run, and we're like, oh, that's cool. Like, really cool. And we finished our meal. Our dogs were done. We make them carry their gear, and humans can walk way farther than dogs do. A 13-mile day for a dog in that heat. It was really hot. They were ready for bed. So open up the tent. They go in. They go to sleep. We finished cleaning up camp, and we get in our tent. And we didn't see anyone hiking in there. We didn't see anyone the last probably 8 miles. So there's no one in the meadow system. There's no sign of people in there, no noise. It gets dark, starts getting dark, and we're laying in the tent. And we hear what sounds like someone splitting firewood, just the driest firewood. Crack! It was so loud, echoing off these huge meadow walls. This meadow is probably 3/4 mile across. You just hear it echoing. And I knew that there's another camping area about 1/4 mile up the trail on this tree island that's in the middle of the meadow system. There's a really pretty spot to camp. So I assumed people were camping there. And this wood splitting went on for 45 minutes or more, loud. I mean, just loud. I was remarking to my wife, man, I'm like, it almost sounds like gunshots. It's so loud. And it started getting closer to us, to the point to where the sounds of this, what we thought was wood being split, was 100 feet into the trees that we are now camped next to. Like there were people camped in there. So we hear that wood splitting crack right in there. And it was odd. And I'm like, man, we didn't see anyone in there. And we're right next to where this is happening now. I'm like, it doesn't really make much sense that they're moving around splitting firewood. But we chalked it up to people being out there camping. And the wood splitting stopped after about 45 minutes. That noise anyways. And then we started hearing this sound, that thump, thump. On that ground up there, being volcanic and made with a lot of pumice, a lot of air pockets in the ground. And when you run on that stuff, you can hear the footsteps, even humans walking on it, people walking on it. But it wasn't footprints or footsteps. It was rocks being thrown towards our tent. Big rocks, football size, softball size rocks. Boom, 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 boom. And these rocks got closer and closer. I mean, to the point to where they were hitting 5 feet away from our tent. And I told my wife, I'm like, you know what? I'm like, these are drunk out here camping. I'm like, we come out here to get away from people, and here we are. We end up setting up right next to someone. I'm like, if this continues, I'm like, I'm gonna go out there and talk to him. My wife's, oh, don't go out there and get in a fist fight in the middle of the forest. I'm like, there's plenty of room for these people to go camping. Here they are camping right next to us and being drunk, throwing rocks at our tent. So this continues, and it gets closer to the tent, and I'm like, I'm gonna go out there and talk to him. So I started getting up, and my wife's, just leave it be. Well, I'm like, if they hit our tent, I'm going out there. And so we listened to this rock throwing go on for 30 to 45 minutes. It's well dark now, and the rock throwing stops. And a few minutes later, we hear 3 or 4 things standing maybe 25 feet away from our tent, in between our tent and that tree line. You can hear them talking, but it's not a discernible language. It's super low. And the best way I heard it described is if someone was talking in a really deep voice and you played it backwards. You catch sections of it, and then it was so low in frequency, like parts of it would drop out from what you can hear, and then you pick it back up, and you could hear these things chattering back and forth right outside our tent. And it probably only lasted a couple minutes, and then it was quiet the rest of the night. In the morning, we woke up early, So we wanted to get to Eileen Lake. So we were up and out of the tent by 6. And I decided to hike into that tree area where I thought people were camping. And there's no campsite in there. There's no sign that anyone was ever camping in there. But around our tent were quite a few large rocks that weren't there in the morning. You can see where they had hit on the pumicy ground and skidded. And like I said, I just assumed it was people, but there was no people there. And so we packed up our tent and hiked up to Eileen Lake and spent our week or so time up there enjoying ourselves. Never had anything else happen up at Linton Meadows that whole trip. Our first trip into Linton Meadows, by the way, we hiked from the Cascade Lakes highway side of it. So it was a 16 or 17 mile hike. I ended up taking a wrong turn and ended up adding a couple miles to it. And our first hike in there, just the only other thing I've had happen, our first time up there, we went to Husband Lake. Made it in there. We were whooped. The dogs were whooped. They were laying down in the shade every time we stopped, so it was time to stop. And our goal was to get to Eileen Lake, and that was our first time up there. We camp on this huge rock outcropping that overlooks this lake. And after we set up the tent, this 5-point black-tailed deer just comes out of the bushes, and it's within 10 feet of our tent. And I have my 2 dogs there, and they're not growling or barking. They're watching this deer. It's just clopping around. It was so close I could have reached out and touched this animal. And it made me a little uneasy about the health of this animal. And it's getting later in the year too, so it possibly could have been rut. And so I told my wife, I'm like, just don't mess with it and it'll go away. It hung around our tent well into the evening, to the point where the sun had dropped down. In fact, actually, I was laying in there and it was sniffing the tent. And it ended up laying down right outside of our tent, feet away from us, laying down. And I never put 2 and 2 together, but I think what it was is that deer had been being chased and it was around us for safety. And that's my speculation on it anyways. Really odd. Yeah, you could have gotten that thing with a slingshot. Boy, it would have been hunter's dream too. It was a nice looking buck. It was a beautiful buck. But yeah, so that was my experiences in Linton Meadows there. And I spent a lot of time in that area. In fact, actually years later, me and my buddy that I ended up starting the backpacking guide service with, we bushwhacked 8 miles from Linton Meadows, no trail route, to get to, or Linton Lake, to get to the meadow section. And it's super rugged. I mean, you're going up steep hillsides that are just covered in 8 to 10 foot rhododendron. And I remember on my hike up there that I ended up coming across tree structures in there, and it's just in the middle of absolute nowhere where no one hikes. You might get a hiker through there once every 10 years. Someone like us, I was really pushing what they wanted to do. A miserable hike up, beautiful though. Multiple tree structures up in there, big trees piled up on each other. I always thought it was odd. What was this doing? I mean, it wasn't tree fall. I mean, someone had stacked it, and I just thought it was odd. But that area up there ended up burning later in a fire around 2015 or so. I think there was a big fire up there, and it burnt through a lot of that stuff up there. And I actually took my family on a week-long backpacking trip up there the following year, or maybe it's 2 years after that fire had burned. Actually, my neighbor has a little airplane, so I actually traded off some work with him, and he took me on a flight so I could do reconnaissance to make sure we weren't just going to be hiking through a complete burn for a week. And it's a beautiful area. But yeah, I took my family up there, and they really enjoyed it. Half of them had already been up there for my wedding that we did up at those lakes. And yep, never had anything else happen up there. And then 2011, Diamond Peak Wilderness. So that's just east of us. You go out Hills Creek. And I don't know where you've been around here, but I wouldn't be surprised if you went out that direction, because that's a great direction to go. But east of Eugene, or east of Oakridge, you run into Diamond Peak Wilderness. And I mean, it's a big mountain you can see when you're driving up the highway.
Oh, okay. I get it.
Yep, Snow Peak capped and everything.
Yeah.
And there's a beautiful loop in there. And I really love backpacking in that area. And so it's my first time doing the wilderness loop, and it's about a 30-mile loop, and we take about a week to do them. And so it was my wife, me, and my buddy Ryan from Pendleton that I went to school with. We started out from Trapper Creek Trailhead, which is by Shelter Cove Resort there on Odo Lake. And our second night, we ended up at Marie Lake. Well, me and my wife had just bought a brand new REI backpacking tent. I mean, it was the Big Agnes SL. It was a $600 tent, really nice piece of gear. It only weighed 2.5 pounds. It was so nice to really get our pack weight trimmed down, so we could do these bigger trips and not die doing them. And so we set up at Marie Lake, and there's one camp spot. That's at the front side of the lake there. There's another one you got to bushwhack to on the other side, but there's no one in the first spot, so we took it. No people around or anything like that. We set up on the grassy area in between the campsite that was in the woods, about 100 feet from the side of the lake. We were about 50 feet closer to the lake in the grassy area that leads right to the lake's edge. And we did our thing, went to sleep. I had my 2 dogs with me, Huey and Nori, and we wake up in the morning, and my wife's side of the tent, it's got a full rain fly on it. It's a heavy duty tent for backpacking, 3.5 plus season tent. It's stout. This thing can take some storms. And we wake up and the rain fly is ripped on her side. The zipper's ripped out of the seam on her side. The mesh body of the tent, which is all mesh, her zipper side was ripped open, destroyed the zipper, and there's urine on top of this tent. It was about probably close to 5.5 feet tall, the peak of the tent. Just about tons of the stinky urine on it, and I was pretty pissed off. I'm a brand new tent that just got ripped up and shredded, and I don't know why I didn't wake up. My dogs didn't alert us. My wife didn't alert us. And she was on that side of the tent. I was actually just talking to her about this the other night. I'm like, and we just didn't know what to think about what happened with the tent. So we taped it back together to make the trip work. And the funny thing is, where it was ripped, like that's my wife's side. I'm like, yeah, now that I know what's going on, I'm like, you could have had something reaching in over the tent on you. I don't know why we didn't wake up. I that's the only weird, I'm not much on the woo side of the phenomena, but that's unexplainable. Because you're going to hear that stuff, that ripstop nylon, to be able to rip it. I mean, it's loud. If you rip it, it's super loud. And man, at least for the dogs to alert. So luckily REI had their return policy. We took it back and got a brand new tent for free. So there was no loss on that. So that was in Diamond Peak Wilderness. In 2013, we moved up here and bought this property that we're on right now. Moved from Oakridge or from Eugene up to here, and it was so nice to get back out of the city. Spending a decade plus in Eugene was all the city, all I need for the rest of my life. And so we got up here. I know this area well, and we started, as we were living up here, we explored it like I did Eugene when I first got out here. And now that I was living up here, I could just leave out my back door, and in 15 minutes I could be at Wilderness Edge, and it was just so much to see and do. So we decided to check out Huckleberry Lake, which is just up the road from us. It's about 11 miles from here, probably 12 miles. Not very far. It takes about 20 minutes or so to get up there. And it's this little lake that isn't used a lot. So we pull off at this trailhead, really brushy road. So you're driving your truck down, everyone calls it Cascade pinstriping here. Anyone that's out in the woods up here and drive, you can tell by looking at the truck what they do, because everyone's got the scrape marks from these branches dragging down the side of their vehicle. So we find this trailhead, and this lake's in this bowl that sits well below the road, and it's backed up by this big 1,000-foot tall cliff that makes Huckleberry Mountain. There's a fire lookout up on top of it, which you can't see from the lake. But I had, my boys were probably about 2 years old at the time, so we had them in backpack carriers. Abby was 3.5 or 4, and I usually open carry. When I started hiking with my kids, I started just bringing a gun just in case. Not scared or worried about anything. I just felt like it was a smart move to make, especially where we went and the stuff we did. And so we hiked down to this lake and come up to it. And it's really brushy. There's just a big enough spot to get out of the brush to see the lake when you first come down to it. And there's this really faint fisherman's trail that goes around the east side of the lake. And it takes you through this rhododendron thicket, 7-8 foot tall rhododendron thicket. And you're stepping over logs, and you get to the outlet creek, and you got to walk a log to get over the outlet creek to this semi-established camp spot that's at the end of the lake. And it's up in these bigger trees, the rhododendron there, so there's a spot to put a tent. We hung out there and had lunch. The kids splashed around in the lake. We spent probably an hour there, and I started getting that uneasy feeling again. And my wife, I know she was packing up stuff. I'm like, "Are you ready to get out of here?" And she said, "Yep." So we put the boys back in the backpack carriers. I had one, and my wife had the other boy on her back, and my wife led the way out. And so I had Abby in front of me, and as we're walking, we cross that outlet creek and we get back into the really thick rhododendron. That feeling that I got, like when I was scouting some of those grow sites over there, it came back on, just hit instantly. I was like, oh man, I just want out of here. I just want to get back to the truck and get out of here. And it was so strong on that trip that Abby was about 20, 30 feet in front of me. I told her to come back towards me, and I actually unholstered my gun and took it off safe and just kept it at the ready on the side, and just waiting to see it. My wife was in eyesight, and we walked through there. Just a horrible feeling, absolutely horrible feeling. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. It's just, and you're in it too when you're out there. You're not going to run from it. So you just deal with it and slowly move on. But boy, is it uncomfortable. My hair was up on the back of my neck, and I'm just sitting there waiting for something to come out. I'd stop every minute or so and just listen. I never heard anything, but The feeling got stronger as the deeper we made it into those rhododendrons. And we made it back to where the trail dropped into the lake, and then you switch back up this ridge back to the road. And we get up there, load the kids up, load the backpacks up, and I asked my wife, I'm like, what did you think of that lake? You could probably go backpacking there. It's right out our back door. And my wife says, I never want to go back down there again. She said, I got the worst feeling coming out of there. And that's when I told her that I experienced the same thing. I'm like, yeah, I actually unholstered my gun. I had it off on safe and called Abby back to me because it just felt so imminent. So imminent. Yeah, it was unbelievable. I actually, years later, teased the idea of going down there with my buddy, which you met down there.
Yeah.
Because he's had his experiences.
Exactly.
And he's actually so frightened by his experiences that he hasn't really gone camping since then. And I never stopped camping. And the more I know about this, a little bit more apprehensive I am about putting myself in these vulnerable situations. But we were actually going to go up there and camp at that lake, just me and him, just to understand this a little bit more. I've had so many encounters with this, and now that I was starting to wake up to what was going on, I wanted, with some clarity, to experience this and get some more answers. And we ended up having a massive fire, Cedar Creek fire, burnt through that year. We were going to go up there. I mean, that a couple weeks later was when we were planning on camping it, and the Cedar Creek fire burnt through in 2021. And it just cooked all that area. Huckleberry burnt, and the lake around it burnt. I haven't been up there since. They've had the road closed off. I think it's back open now, but I wouldn't imagine it would be the same kind of place to go to. Plus, camping under burnt out trees that have been there for a couple years isn't the best decision to make. Yeah, it's right out our back door. And same right out my back door, my property backs up to National Forest. There's private lots around us, but we're this little tongue of houses that are spread out all on big plots of land like what we have. We probably have one of the smaller chunks of land out here at 14 acres. Most everyone else has 60 to 100 acres, but outside of that, it's just National Forest. And when I first moved up here, the logging that you saw coming up the road, that hadn't happened. So it was a continuous thick stretch of nice 80 to 100-year-old trees that had grown up here. I mean, you're just driving the trees the whole way. So I worked in Eugene at the time, and I always did side jobs. So I'd take customer side jobs in on chainsaws, generators, or whatever, just to make some money on the side. And when I get home, I would go out to the shop up there, the red shop, and I would work on these things. And sometimes I'd be out there till midnight or later. And as I'm working out there, I had this happen 8 or 9 times. I'd be out there working in the middle of the night, and something would come and hit the side of that shop so hard. I mean, it shook that whole shop. I mean, that whole shop would shake hard enough to where it's a two-story barn, essentially, hard enough to where dust would fall through the slats from the upper story onto you. I thought it was an animal upstairs a couple times. So I went up there with a pry bar waiting to club a raccoon or something, but there was never anything up there. And now I realize I was probably being harassed and chased by these things. But I got that feeling a couple times up there when I shut it down and walked back to the house late at night. I got that same kind of creepy feeling that I've had at Huckleberry Lake and other times. And once the logging kicked in there the last 6 years or so, a lot of that seemed to have gone away. But of course, I don't spend late nights out there doing it anymore. I run my business from my property now. So, I'm already doing 40, 50 hour weeks out there. So I'm not out there at 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night anymore. But really interesting stuff. And at that point in time, I was pretty well aware about what was going on, and felt pretty lucky to have the stuff so close for a guy that's looking for some answers and clarity on it. So I don't have to go 2 hours away to find the answers for the stuff that's happened to me. And recently here in December of last year, I went up to Kitson, or CT Beach area, and explored with the kids. And there's a little bridge that goes across one of the arms of the reservoirs. In the wintertime, they drain the reservoirs for flood control. And so what would normally be underwater is just back down to mud banks and the river that used to feed the reservoir body. And I took the kids there after Christmas. It was a few days after Christmas, so December 28th, 29th. And it was a stormy, snowy day, but I wanted to get out and do some exploring. So we went down there and hiked down to the river, parked on top of no cars, no people around us. And while we're down there, we got almost sounded like gunshots, these sharp cracks ringing out through the woods. And I almost assumed that someone was up there shooting. So the kids came running over to me, and we're down lower elevation from where the noise is happening. And I'm like, it might be someone over there, maybe shooting their pistol or something like that, So we end up hiking out of there. I hiked across the bridge. I was going to go talk to these people about, making sure that they were shooting in a safe direction and stuff like that. And so we get over there, and there's no cars on the other side of the bridge. And the only road going in there is a really narrow paved road. There's no other roads above it. And it wasn't, thinking about it, it wasn't someone up there shooting their gun, because people are out there shooting their pistols. It didn't sound like a high-powered rifle. It was definitely a pistol. It sounded more like a pistol. And when people are shooting their pistols, they'll go bang, I mean, this is just like crack, and then it would change directions where it's coming from in another portion of the wood. But we loaded up in the truck and we went a little further down the road, and there's a place called Kitson Hot Springs. It's administrated and owned by BSA now. It's a little chunk of private land that's nestled in the national forest there. They used to have old hot springs house there. I don't know if you made your way up there, but oh man, it's super cool. Super cool place. This was right after the CT Beach incident. And so we go in there, and I always wanted to explore it. And they have the old hot spring foundation for the lodge that they used to have. There's still hot water coming up through there, and really cool area. We hiked across this little bridge, and there's these 3-sided shelters that the Boy Scouts used to use for their summer jamborees and stuff like that. And in the mud on these trails and these roads that ran on the other side of there were old footprints, big ones, 16, 17-inch footprints. They were small footprints. They were all over the place in there, from fresh to ones that you could tell had been up there for a few weeks. And I know people have had run-ins and encounters up there before, and I've never cast at a track. And I'm planning on going back up there later in the year, and when things slow down, and I want to find a good track to add a cast to my collection. So I've had other stuff happen to me. I've had the classic wood knocks and stuff like that happen. I've never heard screams or yells. I've had buddies that have, the guy that you met, but I never had, other than the murmuring that I heard at Linton Meadows. That's the only audible noise I've ever heard from. And also, I want to note something too. I never have had the smell. Never.
Yeah, okay. That's really interesting.
Yep. And people talk about it, and I have never, when I've had these run-ins, I have never smelt that smell that people describe. And maybe it was the way the wind was blowing, but for me, in my situations that I ran into, smell wasn't part of it. It just wasn't. Yeah, that's a rundown of what I've experienced since 2008. And like I always tell some of my friends that know my stories that don't backpack, they're always really curious about it. And I think about how many nights I've spent out camping and the remote spots that I've gone to, and you have to be out there so much. 99.9% of the time, you're not going to have anything happen. Mm-hmm. It's that 0.1% of the time that this stuff happens. And it's such an oddball event that you don't really think much of it. People are always like, oh, why don't you go out there and just see what it is? You have to be in the situation to understand it. You really have to be in there. And it's just so close to what humans would sound like. That's what I think it gets rid off more than not, as people just thinking they're hearing other people out there. And maybe more people would be surprised. That may not always be the case.
Kevin, thank you so much for sharing your years of things that have happened all over the state, which just is incredible. Do you have a few minutes if I could ask you a few questions?
Sure.
Okay. In the Diamond Peak wilderness incident, we had discussed that at the booth, but it's really interesting to hear more details about it. There was actually a lot of urine that was gathered at the top of the tent.
Yeah, because when the fly got torn, it has a full coverage rain fly that goes over the main body of the tent. Most modern backpacking tents look like this. And it has this hub system where the poles cross over on top. So it creates a flatter spot on top. If the fly is not zipped up, it loses that tension. So you get a little low spot that kind of forms in the top when it's unzipped. Yeah, and there was that yellowish urine that was up on the top side of it.
That's what I was going to ask, if you remembered any details. Being a wilderness individual, you probably are aware of what kind of urine from different creatures in the forest looks like. And so this was, you said, a yellowish color?
It was yellowish. It was urine. I mean, the only animal I know of around here that could possibly deposit something like that up there would be male cougars, and they spray. They can spray pretty far. They can put their markings 5 feet up on a tree and stuff, and they back up to it, and pretty gross, putrid stuff. But this wasn't cat urine. It smelled like someone's been eating too much asparagus and drank a bunch of beer the night before, But it was pooled in the rainfly that was down on the ground. And it's on the side that was ripped out. And I teased my wife about that. Like, there you are sleeping, and imagine you might have this big hand reaching. I couldn't imagine that it wouldn't have reached into the tent. I'm like, pretty incredible. And I've always entertaining the idea of taking a game camera with me when I'm going out backpacking now, but I don't know if they can detect it. I don't speculate too much on that, but the fact that there's just very few game camera pictures that are going to be credible enough to even want to talk about. I think it would lessen your chances of experiencing anything.
We had discussed Spirit Lake at the booth, right? That's come up with a few individuals, and I've talked to people before I got here about a lot of different encounters that have happened in that area. Were you the individual that talked about the sticks in Spirit Lake? Have you heard about that?
I've heard people have had strange run-ins up there. I mean, hence the namesake of the lake. Spirit Lake, Devil's Canyon, all these places, I guess, condensate from the Chinook jargon of the Indians that were around here. But no, I've camped up there quite a bit. Very remote. That part's all burnt up in the Cedar Creek now. That's all a big burn scar up there. No, I've camped up there plenty. I haven't had any run-ins up there. But I will say the times that I've camped up there, it's been with my group of backpacking buddies. We all drag our campers up. They have kids that are my age, and there'll be 18 of us up there. And going in big groups and backpacking with big groups, there's just too much noise, in my opinion. It only happens when you're being quiet. And I think smaller groups, maybe it's more approachable, but I could see it. I mean, there's plenty. I've had locals that have told me about stuff that's gone on up there, and I know that area carries a lot of that those kind of stories. And
the specific thing I want to make sure that I remember to put on recording is I had multiple hunters say that they've been there in around dusk or nighttime. All the sticks that are in the lake will go to the center of the lake, form a circle, and then start rotating in a circular fashion, which magnetic field or just high strangeness, it seems like a really interesting area.
Yeah, definitely. I've hiked into Spirit Lake once. It was actually right before the summer before Cedar Creek burnt it up there, and I just wanted to check it out. And it's a beautiful lake. The hike going in there, was absolutely gorgeous. Huge trees. But yeah, we got up there and there's a big meadow on one end of it. And I didn't see anything unusual. It is a beautiful lake though. Absolutely beautiful. I've been around a lot of these mountain lakes, and I can't say I've ever seen any weird anomalies with sticks floating around and swirling in the middle of a lake. But come evening time, you get these inflows and outflows of air that move through these valley systems. So during the daytime, as the lowlands heat, the wind moves up valley, and as it cools, that cold air sinks back down. And Spirit Lake's kind of in this bowl, and so I mean, if you ever watch the wind come in on these lakes, you can actually see the ripples on the lakes. It actually hits the lake from straight up on top and billows out and around. If I saw something like that, I would probably attribute it more to that. I'm not saying that these guys didn't experience something that was strange.
Kevin, this has been an incredible interview, and thank you for your hospitality, for allowing me to come out to your beautiful home area. The woods are literally just on the side of your yard, and it's like everything is right here. And thank you so much for your hospitality.
Oh, no problem. It was a pleasure meeting you. All the way from Iowa too. So what do you think? You think you come back to Pacific Northwest for more Bigfoot adventures?
I think it is definitely just beginning, and I don't think this is the last time that I will be in Oakridge for sure.
I might have a couple questions for you on this side. You being from Iowa, we talked about your experiences that you experienced in your neck of the woods over there. Yeah, how does it rate for your Iowan Bigfoot experiences compared to what you've experienced in the last few days here in this area?
What I experienced just outside of Oakridge has blown everything that I've ever experienced out of the water, because we experienced things like growl/scream vocalizations right next to the meadow we were at. I found a track by where a visual had been seen just the day before, and then we were up there, and he was able to really analyze the area for about 45 minutes to an hour, and he found a solid set of tracks, and these are like splayed. How you have the tracks where like really spread out like that. Like I actually saw that in real life, and I was like, oh, these can be legit. Usually those tracks look like they're faked, but like it was there. I saw it.
Did he cast?
They were not casted. The way that it was, what it was stepping over would have made it extremely hard to be casted. But there's no doubt there was. Did I tell you about the apple, the fruit? Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, the apple and the orange and banana that was left from the group the day before. And that we went back, and the apple was left there uneaten, and the orange was on the ground uneaten, but the banana was on the ground and peeled and eaten, and just things like that. Never experienced stuff like that in Iowa. I have had some things happen, but like it is a totally different world out here. And you do have to be really careful. You go out there and there's no cell service. There's huge predators. You get a flat or your car blows up. You have to hike back to town at least 20 miles, and there's not many chances out here for sure, but it is beautiful.
Yep. Lots of people. I mean, the sneaky thing about this area is the access is so good. There's so many points of access, and they can take you so far out into the wilderness. A lot of people don't realize how far out there they really are. You have these roads that go 40, 50 miles, 60 miles into these wilderness areas, and your cell phone coverage drops as soon as you get off 58. Anywhere off 58 out here, it's dropped, and that's just kind of part of this area. But yeah, that's the way I've always looked at it. Is I think it should be approached with caution. When I'm not much on the Bigfoot woo side of things, I've looked a little bit into it, and from my experiences, it doesn't line up. I think it's some kind of biological, physical animal. It seems that's the most logical starting point. I don't know if you have any opinions on what you think it is from a physical standpoint. Relic hominid.
After experiencing something that could peel a banana and eat it, I'm definitely a physical creature. I think physical creature that can do stuff that science has no idea how to explain it. Yep. So some people say that's a cop-out, but I think that it's not too bad of an explanation. That's what I'm thinking right now. So.
Yep. Yeah, that's been my take on it. So my word of caution, it's kind of Bigfoot's been mainstream for quite a while, and a lot of people out there looking for it. My experience and run-ins with these things, last thing I would do is go out there and start hooting and hollering and banging your chest. I think as little as we know about these things and as intelligent as I presume they are, I think caution should be used, and especially with small kids, and being a father of 3 and camping in remote spots, and we still backpack quite a bit. I think it's really important to keep an eye on this stuff and realize that this isn't a zoo. You're in a super rugged, wild area. If it isn't animals you have to deal with, it's other natural phenomenon like these wildfires. We're surrounded by wildfires, and that's been the norm for quite a while up here. And I don't subscribe to the idea that these things want to be friendly and want to be seen. Obviously, if they wanted to do harm, they had their chances with me, and they could have. But the fact of the matter is, it's a really thin line from what I experienced to actually having physical altercations with them. And I think if you do it enough, I think you're going to come across it. Like even Ronnie and Dwayne, those guys, they've been experiencing this for decades. And you see how uncomfortable they can get in those experiences. Mm-hmm. That should show you. So the people that are out there that think that these things want to sit down and enjoy their campfire with them, I think they need to understand that these are wild animals. We know very little about them, and they're unpredictable.
Absolutely. Kevin, thank you so much again for your invitation to come out to your property, and hopefully I'll be able to continue conversation in the future.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for taking time out to interview me. This is the first time I've made any official reportings on it. So look forward to some of your podcasts coming from this area, especially, your earlier or late last week stuff. I think that'll be really interesting. I don't know how much you're going to put out there.
Yeah. The following audio shares what happened immediately after this interview in Oakridge.
We're in a bit of an issue. When I went in the woods Thursday, I thought I got horsefly bites. They've escalated into what the wilderness guide says. Wilderness guide I interviewed this morning for the podcast says I potentially have staph infections in both of my legs. The one small doctor's office in Oakridge has said I need to immediately go out to urgent care in Springfield, Oregon. Supposed to be flying out tomorrow, so Oakridge is going to have to unfortunately say goodbye. 2 interviews are not going to happen. This sucks. The old timers are not going to happen unless I come back tonight, but it all depends on what the urgent care says. Yeah. So I made it up to Springfield, Oregon, went into the urgent care per the advice of the wilderness guide.
Thankfully, it was not a staph infection. However, they have no idea what's going on. They say it makes no sense. It looks like something hit a log across my 2 legs. They say there's bruising. It looks like blood is leaking out from inside. I have no idea. They did a full barrage of blood testing, which they'll be sending directly back to my doctor in Des Moines. I'm not gonna lie, I'm freaked. I've got a fever, a little bit of a fever right now. So he says for me to go on antibiotics right away, even before the blood tests are back, just in case there is some bacterial infection. They're saying some sort of cellulitis, one of the causes of which on the paper can be high energy rays. I'm headed back to Oakridge. I got my 2-hour interview this morning, but unfortunately had to cancel a few because of this health mishap. But we are headed back to Oakridge, back to the hotel, and then I'll be flying out of Eugene tomorrow, and then going directly to my doctor. Okay, I'm going to head back to Oakridge. As of time of recording in late August 2024, my legs have completely healed. Both doctors in Oregon and Iowa are not quite sure what caused that issue, but we are in a great spot health-wise right now. No issues. I'll tell you this, next time I go out into the woods, I will be wearing appropriate attire, such as pants and not shorts. Take care of yourselves out there, guys, and we'll talk to you next time. Please take a minute to help out the show by subscribing on YouTube, making sure you hit the bell so you don't miss any notifications, and share the episode on YouTube with a friend. Also, if you're listening to us on a podcast, thank you so much. Make sure that you're subscribed, share the show with a friend. Really, it's all about sharing the show wherever you can. If you've had a Bigfoot encounter related to the following or know someone who has, please reach out to me at bigfootsociety@gmail.com or pass on my email. Here's the list. If you've had any encounters in Oregon, which I'm sure there's probably a few of you out there, please feel free to reach out immediately. You can use email bigfootsociety@gmail.com. A special thank you to all the Bigfoot Society Patreon and YouTube channel members. It's your support that helps keep the show going, and I extremely appreciate it. If you want to join in the fun, you can join over at patreon.com/the Bigfoot Society. I'll see you there. And again, thanks for listening.
Her and I can get on here and we can tell our stories. Maybe there's somebody else out there listening that's too afraid to tell their story. Maybe this will give them the courage to come out and not feel so bad about it. Who cares what anybody thinks? I know what I saw. I know what's out there. That's all I care about.
Let people know. Please let them know. If you ever see one of these things, you need to tell. Because if you don't, then shame on you. You know? Shame on you.